I'm Jeff Stark. Thanks for being with me today. This is the eighth video in a series of videos that we've titled Quarreling and Fighting. We've looked into the matter of quarreling and fighting because it's a very common phenomenon. Obviously, it takes place in the course of probably the vast majority of our relationships over the years. And it can be very, very destructive and something that counselors, biblical counselors and Christian counselors have to address very, very frequently. In this eighth video, we're going to be addressing a particular element of quarreling and fighting that I have found to be very rarely addressed. Actually, I've never read anything that someone's written about this. I can't find anything that's written. I've not listened to any podcasts. I don't remember this particular subset of quarreling and fighting addressed in a sermon. But it's almost always present when you have two people quarreling and fighting. And it's also extremely destructive, but it's very, very rarely looked at, addressed, and tried to thought through and work through from a biblical perspective. The area that I'm talking about, this subset of quarreling and fighting that we're talking about here in video number 8, is the matter of defensiveness. When you find two people who are quarreling and fighting with each other, as I oftentimes do in my counseling situation, my counseling room, if I am interviewing a husband and a wife and they begin to quarrel and fight with each other, which is not uncommon, and that's why they're there, and they actually oftentimes are very willing to quarrel and fight right in front of me, which is fine, because it gives me a chance to watch them and listen to them and learn about them and try to understand them. But this ingredient, this subset of quarreling and fighting is always present, and I say that carefully, always present in the context of quarreling and fighting, and this is what typically happens in what we're talking about today, and that is defensiveness. Okay, so the husband says something to the wife about something that she did that was wrong, unfair, improper, inaccurate. Well, she quickly reacts and says, that's not true, no, you're wrong, that isn't what happened, and then she launches into a counterattack with her interpretation. Well, he's annoyed because he's feeling insulted, he's feeling attacked, no, she's exaggerating, so he quickly reacts to her, defensively defending his position. And that defensiveness on both persons' parts are something that will take place for a long, long time. It probably won't stop until somebody stops it. And oftentimes in my counseling situation, I'll let that go on for a while, but eventually I have to call it to a conclusion, say, let's stop this now. Let's take a step back and let's look at what's going on here. Now, but the defensiveness is an integral part of why people quarrel and fight. And we want to look at this very, very briefly today. It's not exhaustive, it's not complete, but it is a window into this matter of defensiveness. And here's what we're going to be talking about today. Number one, what does it mean to be defensive? What does it look like? What does it sound like? If we were to observe it, number one, we're going to look at what that looks like. And number two, we're going to look at what are the results of this defensiveness when a husband or a wife or when friends get into a quarrel and fight and they're becoming defensive. What's the results of quarreling and fighting and defensiveness? Where can we predict that this will lead to? And we'll conclude our session today, number 8, briefly talking about the results of that. Okay, so let's get started. What does it mean when we talk about defensiveness? What does that look like? I gave you a little bit of a window in that example that I was giving to you with a husband and wife who were quarreling and fighting. She heard something that she thought was inaccurate, an attack upon her righteous character, her goodness, something that was not true, something that was unfair, and she reacted. So with that illustration in mind as just one of many possible illustrations that we could use, there's 4 things I'd like to bring up that seems to indicate defensiveness when we see it, when we hear it, and when we watch it on the part of our spouses, perhaps, our children, or even as we're paying attention to ourselves. Number 1. Defensiveness tends to be very reactionary. It's not slow, it's not cautious, it's not careful, it's not deliberate, it's very quick, it's very reactive, it's actually almost instantaneous. It's like a knee-jerk reaction. I hear something that I think my husband is saying to me or my wife is saying to me, and like a knee-jerk reaction, I hit the funny bone and boom, the knee pops up. It's a knee-jerk reaction of defensiveness, and that I display when I'm hearing something that I think is unfair. So it's number one, it's very reactionary. It is not cautious, it's not careful, it's not deliberate, it's not slow. It's quite the contrary. It's a very quick reaction to something that I've heard. Usually something that I consider offensive, unfair, or inaccurate. Number two, there's a defensive posture that defensiveness can take, and that is when I hear something that's untrue, I can get defensive and I can do something like this. I can say, you know what, that's not true. I back off. That's not true. That's not accurate. That's not fair. What you're saying is not really describing me. Or someone accuses me and I get defensive. I say, I never did that. I never would do that. And so it's a quick reaction of saying, that's not me. I wouldn't do that. That's not what I did. It's a defensive nature in lieu of our being defensive. But there's also, number three, there's a defensiveness that goes on the offense, if I can put it in those terms. So there's a defensiveness where we defend ourselves, but there's a defensiveness where I go actually on the offensive. And it would sound something like this. A wife is accused a husband in this case of doing something wrong, egregious, unfair, and she says something to him like, you're always being mean, okay? And he hears the word always, and he reacts quickly, like a knee-jerk reaction. And he'll say something like this, me? I'm mean? What about you? You're mean too. So that happens very, very quickly, but you'll notice in his defensiveness, he's going on the offense. Secondly, it sounds like he might say, I'm not like that, or he may turn the tables and say, well, you're like that too. I remember about 2 months ago, I was in a dispute, a spat with somebody, and I was telling that particular person how I thought they were behaving in a situation, and the person instantaneously, knee-jerk reaction said, well, you do that too. You know, I wasn't gonna debate that. I would be willing to admit that that was true, but that really wasn't the subject. But the point was the person reacted defensively and went on the offense and turned the tables and kind of threw it back into my face. I was asking them to consider that, but they, in defensiveness, reacted poorly and threw it back in my face, and that's what we call defensiveness. One person in defensiveness might go on the offensive saying, you're lying, you're not telling the truth, that's not accurate. Or they might say something like, you know what, you're just like your father. Your father did that with your mother for years. And in defensiveness say, you're just like your father, you've been that way ever since I've known you, and you never change, and you're going to end up just like your dad. And that's defensive, but it's also going on the offensive. Or another way of turning the tables and being offensive is, you think I bring up the past? You bring up the past all the time. You're still talking to me about the things that I did wrong on my honeymoon 15, 10, 20 years ago. Remember the vacation, summer vacation we took ashore. And do you remember how angry and upset you got? You're telling me that I'm angry. Remember when you got angry. And so that's another form of defensiveness where we react badly, we have a knee-jerk reaction, and we turn the tables and we attack the other person by pointing out things that they've done that may be identical to the things they're pointing out to me, or it may be something different. But that's all of what we talk about in terms of defensiveness. Lastly, number 4. Defensiveness is a very intense emotional reaction to something that I consider inaccurate or unfair. It's a very intense emotional reaction to something that I'm being accused of, that I'm considering either to be inaccurate or unfair. And when I hear something that's inaccurate and unfair, if I react defensively, then it tends to be not only a very quick knee-jerk reaction, but it also is there's a forcefulness behind it. There's defensiveness is kind of like a counterpunch. You're hearing something that feels like a punch to you, an accusation perhaps. And when you get defensive, you're going to react to that. You're going to counterpunch. You got hit, you're going to turn and hit the other person back. And very frequently, it's also aggressive. And what I mean by that is that if you feel like you're being attacked, well, when you get defensive, you're going to turn the tables, and if you took one punch, you're going to not only offer one punch back, but very often we punch back twice. Verbally, obviously, I'm talking about here. Now, if the husband hears the wife counterpunch with something that he considers unfair or inaccurate, well, what defensiveness usually does is turns the tables, attacks the person in return, and he's going to attack back with a counterpunch of 3 punches. And it escalates and grows and grows and grows, and it's very, very destructive, obviously. It's when you're getting defensive, you're oftentimes accusing. It's accusatory. It's inciting. The things that we say when we're being defensive are inflammatory. They're provoking, and oftentimes they're very biting. And that's the point of it. We've been accused, and it's unfair, and so I'm reacting in defensiveness and going on the offense, for example, and counterpunching in relationship to something that I've been accused of as well. That's called defensiveness. We're all familiar with it. But that happens very frequently and very intensely in quarreling and fighting. And that's what I was describing earlier on. If I had a husband and a wife in my office and I'm watching them quarreling, they're going back and forth, and at the heart of their quarreling and fighting is this defensiveness. That's reaction, punch, counterpunch, counterpunch, punch, counterpunch, punch, punch. And it just escalates and becomes worse and worse and worse. And that leads us to our second point and our concluding point, and that is, what's the results of a relationship where defensiveness is a very common element of the way that they communicate with each other? Well, 99% of the time that couples get defensive, or one person in the relationship gets defensive, 99% of the time it always turns out bad. 99% of the time it turns out very, very badly. There's 1% of the time when it doesn't turn out badly. And in that very, very rare situation of the 1%, you have somebody in that relationship who is not reacting in defensiveness. And if there's one person who does not get defensive in those situations, it will not turn out disastrously. It will be very hard, it will be very difficult, it will be very painful, but that one person who has learned not to be defensive, and why not to be defensive, they will stall the inevitability of destructiveness that will take place in that marriage if they were not in that 1%. But it's so rare to find someone who does not get defensive in those situations. Overwhelmingly, most people, when accused, get defensive in ways that we've talked about today. Now, what are the results of that? Well, if that happens long enough and systemically enough and consistently enough and frequently enough, then over a long period of time, as they've had dozens and perhaps hundreds of conversations that have escalated like that, and with defensiveness and argumentation and quarreling and fighting, well, eventually that couple is going to reach one of two things is going to happen. That couple, for example, will probably end up talking to each other, because they've both learned that we can't talk to each other without it escalating and maybe coming to blows, so they eventually reach the conclusion that we really can't talk to one another, and they stop talking. And as they stop talking, they just coexist with each other, perhaps for a long, long time, because they know with absolute certainty there's no talking to that person. They're not listening to me. And they're both saying that about the other person. They don't listen to me. They don't pay attention. They don't take me seriously. Well, if you both say that, well, then you're going to stop talking to that person, and that person's going to stop talking to you. And so there is a dead silence in the course of the marriage for maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I saw that play out in my relationship with my mom and dad, who quarreled and fought for 30 years, got divorced, ended up living together out of mutual concern. I won't go into what that means at this point in time, but they ended up living together in their old age. But they never talked to each other. She wouldn't talk and he didn't talk, and they didn't talk to one another because they just simply couldn't go beyond the day-to-day shallow things of what's for dinner and what's on TV, and very, very superficial kind of conversations, because to go deeper was to invite a quarrel and a fight that was escalated by being defensive. And so they just realized, if we're going to live under the same roof, we can't talk to one another. It's very, very, very sad. Very, very sad when that happens. There was only one other, actually there's two more results. Result number 2 is going to end up in divorce. They're either going to coexist without talking, or they're going to end up getting a divorce, because, I don't want to live the rest of my life with someone that I can't talk to, someone I can't be intimate with, and someone who doesn't listen to me. And so let's pull the plug on this thing and let's get a divorce. There is a third result. Hopefully, that as couples find themselves in this kind of a situation, they get biblical counseling. They go to a counselor who's skilled in biblical counseling and understanding these matters of quarreling and fighting and the ingredients and how to help couples stop doing that. But through the power of the gospel and the presence of the Holy Spirit, and through good teaching applied to the heart as they work hard on trying to understand these things, God wants to alter their relationship fundamentally, radically, so that they can go about talking to one another and not quarreling and fighting, recognizing defensiveness and stopping it, and bringing other things into those discussions that are better, and so that they can end their conversations in a constructive, peaceful, and loving manner. That's what biblical counseling seeks to do. So they stop talking and live together that way for a long period of time. They end up in divorce because they don't want to live that way. Or number 3, they could choose to get biblical counseling and say, okay, we're stuck here. We're in a very bad way, and we're asking you and God to help us to understand how can we do things differently and much better, much more honoring and glorifying to Him, and much better to the benefit of each other. That's what biblical counseling would help us to do. Now, by the way, defensiveness only doesn't just take place in the course of husbands and wives. You see this take place among children, among siblings. As I speak right now, I have a daughter who's not talking to another daughter. And they're not talking because I suspect that one or both of them would understand that if they tried to wade into the deep waters of what's going on, they would get defensive, and that's not going to lead anywhere. That's very sad when that happens. But it happens in places at the workplace, and other family members, and so forth and so on. Okay, today, what does it look like, and what are the results? In video number 9, which is going to be the second video regarding this matter of defensiveness, we're going to look at what is the cause of this defensiveness and how can we stop it. Okay, that'll be video number 9. Of quarreling, titled Quarreling and Fighting, which will be subsetted Defensiveness number 2. Hope you'll join me for that, and I hope this is helpful for you. Talk to you then.